You're right.
Okay.
YouTube, sorry, Scott, just to say, but I think it's obvious. On YouTube, there is about 30 seconds, 45 seconds, 1 minute, let's say, of delay, obviously, from this, from our live speaking. So also, if there are some questions, probably you will arrive with some delays. And if it's okay, tell me if you prefer that I report to you at the end of your presentation, or if you prefer that I interrupt you and ask the question directly. But obviously, it will never be directly. You always have some delay question. Let me tell you what you prefer.
Sorry, it's a little hard to hear you, but I think, so I'm not watching the YouTube live, so I think it's best if you're able to share the questions with me. That's probably the best.
It was mostly asking if you want the questions when they come up or at the end of the
I think at the end was probably best.
Okay, at the end. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Partiamo? Ok, so we can start. Ok, buonasera a tutti e tutte, alle persone sia in sala sia alle persone collegate online. Questa sera abbiamo una serata un po' speciale della nostra associazione, dove abbiamo ospite il professore PhD Scott Solomon, ma la presentazione la farà Eleonora breve. Prima di iniziare faccio 2 parole sulla nostra associazione, appunto sia per le persone nuove in sala sia per le persone online. Siamo Celestia Taurinorum, un'associazione di astrofili che opera nell'area di Torino e dintorni. Ci ritroviamo ogni martedì presso questa sede e anche facciamo eventi esterni come conferenze, come To The Space che stiamo facendo esattamente in queste settimane, o serate di osservazione tramite il telescopio, più organizziamo eventi cittadini con diverse entità. Grazie mille di essere qui. Adesso, come avrete visto dalle varie locandine, questa serata sarà in inglese, essendo l'ospite in inglese. Ripeterò questa presentazione in inglese giusto 30 secondi per permettere a Scott di capire e poi potremo partire. Okay, so I just did the introduction in Italian. I will repeat basically the same things. So as I was saying, this is a special evening for us, and I was introducing you, or I mean, I was just saying your name, Professor Scott Solomon, then Eleonora will present you properly. And just to quickly introduce our association, we are called Celestia Taurinorum. Just so you know, Augusta Taurinorum was the Latin name of Torino, our city, and we changed it in Celestia, because you know, Celeste is the sky in Latin/Italian. And yeah, we are a group of scientific communicators and amateur astronomers that does events in the city. Mostly we gather up every Tuesday in this room, but we also do events throughout the city in collaboration with other entities, even with the City Hall, but we also plan night sky observations once a month. Unfortunately, Torino is quite polluted, so we typically go up the mountains, up the Alps to observe. So it's actually, again, a pleasure to have you here as a guest. We are looking forward for your presentation, but before that, let's have Eleonora introducing you. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Eleonora Raya, member of Celestia Taurinorum, and tonight we are delighted to have to host a truly special person, that is Professor Scott Solomon, evolutionary biologist at Rice University in Texas. Thanks to be here. He will speak to us about his new book, Becoming Martian, which I recommend everyone to buy. It is available online to participate in the debate on some of the big issues of the space exploration, such as the evolution of our bodies and minds on Mars, and reproduction and growth of humans on the red planet. But now let me introduce Professor Solomon as he deserves, and then let him speak. Scott Solomon is a teaching professor at Rice University in Houston, Texas. He is also a research associate at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History. He is the author of Future Humans, named Best Book in 2017 by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS. He's also the host of the podcast Wild World with Scott Solomon, and co-writer and co-producer of the podcast Becoming Martian. Thank you, Scott. Now we can let Professor Solomon speak about his new book, Becoming Martian. Thank you, Scott.
Well, thank you so much. What a very kind introduction. Can you hear me okay? Is it coming through?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. That was very, very kind, very generous. I'm delighted to be here. It's really an honor to get to speak with you all about, yes, this topic that I've been researching and writing about for quite a few years now, actually. People often ask, like, well, how long does it take to write a book like this? And it's a hard question to answer because it depends on when you consider the starting point. The book itself I've been working on for about 3 years, but this is a topic that I've been interested in and have been researching for more like 10 to 12 years. So for me, the starting point, whoops, let me see. How do I make my slides advance? Sorry, just a second. There we go. Okay. Okay, that comes through? Okay. So the starting point for me is the observation that people are already working to try to make settlements beyond Earth. So in the past, this is something that seemed like it was more science fiction than reality. And about 10 years ago or so, it became clear to me that people were actually really serious about that people are actively working on trying to actually build permanent bases or even cities beyond Earth with a major focus on Mars. And so I got to see some of this effort for myself. For example, down in South Texas, about 5.5 hours from where I live, Texas is a pretty big state, is this facility here. This is Starbase, which is SpaceX's test and launch facility. And this is Starship, which is designed to carry large numbers of people and supplies to Mars. So Elon Musk says that SpaceX was created to make humanity a multiplanetary species. I got to go down and see Starship during the first ever test launch and went back a year later to actually see the first launch that successfully made it to space. And so this is what really, for me, in many ways, made it clear that this is no longer just science fiction. People are investing a lot of resources and energy into trying to make this happen. But it's not only the space billionaires that are trying to do this. Governmental space agencies, including NASA and the European Space Agency and the Chinese Space Agency, are also interested in sending people both to the moon and ultimately to Mars, with a goal of creating a long-term presence there. So NASA's Artemis project is currently about to launch its second mission. And so Artemis 2 is going to carry these 4 astronauts in an orbit that will take them around the moon, not to land on the moon, but around the moon, in preparation for a landing on the moon in, according to the most recent estimate, in 2 years, in 2028. And it's worth pointing out that these 4 astronauts are actually going to travel deeper into space, farther from Earth than any humans have ever traveled. So we are at the moment right now when we are sending people farther into space than we ever have done before. But as I mentioned, the effort in going back to the moon is not the ultimate goal. So if you look at NASA's Artemis program, it's part of what they call the Moon to Mars architecture, where the idea of going to the moon is to build a base where we can learn lessons and practice basically for being able to go to Mars. So with all of these efforts underway by both private space companies and by various governmental space agencies, my question becomes, what if these efforts are successful? This was actually my entry point and why I started being interested in this question, because I'm an evolutionary biologist and I think about life across generations and how life changes over long time periods. And so my question from the beginning has been, do we actually understand what the consequences would be of creating settlements on other worlds where people are having children and future generations are possibly adapting to the conditions there? So that's kind of what I want to talk about today. I want to back up, though, and point out that we have been fascinated with Mars for quite a long time. I would argue since we've been able to look up in the night sky and look at these objects in the sky, which I know is what many of you love to do, and myself as well. In many ways, our fascination with Mars began with an Italian astronomer. I probably won't pronounce his name correctly, so apologies in advance, but Giovanni Schiaparelli, maybe something close to that, hopefully. He was making observations from his observatory, which I believe was in Milan, if I'm not mistaken, and using a telescope to make some of the most detailed observations yet of what the surface of Mars looked like. And he believed that he was able to see these long lines, these structures that he described as again, in Italian, and this is where I'm actually quite interested in what you guys can tell me about what I've read about the word that he used in Italian, because my understanding is he used the word canali, which in the English translation has been often translated as canal. And you guys can tell me later, perhaps, whether that word maybe has other possible meanings in Italian. But one of the people that Schiaparelli inspired with his work was an American astronomer, Percival Lowell, who heard the word canale and understood this to mean canal in English, which in English would imply a man-made or at least a constructed structure, not a natural feature. And he was really fascinated by that because that would seem to imply that there were some sort of intelligent beings on Mars who were constructing these structures. And so he actually built an observatory in Arizona and dedicated much of his life and his fortune to trying to further advance astronomy and specifically our understanding of Mars. I actually got to go and visit that observatory in Arizona last summer and look through the same telescope that Percival Lowell had looked through. Actually have a globe here. I don't know how well you can see this, but this is a globe that is based on the maps of the surface of Mars that Percival Lowell created that seem to show these lines, or that do show lines on here, which Lowell interpreted as canals that were built by Martians. So this in many ways led to these ideas from science fiction that Mars is a planet that is inhabited, and not only inhabited by some form of life, but inhabited by intelligent, advanced, sophisticated beings. And that led to a flourishing of science fiction, everything from H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds to more fanciful, Edgar Rice Burroughs's A Princess of Mars, and many more on top of that. So our understanding of Mars has, of course, changed quite a bit since those days. And a big leap forward was made in our understanding of Mars in the 1960s with the launch of Mariner 4. This was the first mission to get a close-up look at Mars. It didn't land on Mars, but it did a close enough flyby to be able to get some pretty detailed images of Mars. And I just love this particular detail, which is that the technicians who were working on this mission were so excited to get the data back. And this was in the early days before digital photography was really a thing yet. And so they're getting the information back from the Mariner 4 spacecraft. It's going to be compiled by a computer to make the first detailed image of the surface of Mars, but it was taking too long for the computer to compile. And so what the technicians did is basically colored in using the digital feedback that they were getting, basically a color by number. And they used colored crayons to basically color in what the image was going to look like. And so this actually became the first detailed look at an image of the surface of Mars. And what it showed is that actually Mars is a very barren, very apparently lifelike place. It looked much more like the surface of the moon than it did like the surface of Earth. And so this kind of in many ways dashed many people's hopes that Mars might be home to life today, or certainly to any kind of advanced complex life forms. We have now gone much further than that, and having landed numerous spacecraft on the surface of Mars, and including numerous rovers that have been able to make their way around and explore Mars. One of the really fun and exciting things I got to do in researching my book is join my colleague, Dr. Kirsten Seebach, who is one of the scientists who is part of the scientific team for both the Curiosity rover and the Perseverance rover, two of NASA's rovers that are currently operating on the surface of Mars. And I got to join them in some of their scientific meetings where they were deciding where they were going to send the rover that day and what samples they would like to collect. And actually, what ended up happening later, as you may know, is they've made some discoveries with that rover that seem to be consistent with the idea that life was once present on Mars. They haven't definitively proven that yet, but there's indications that there are minerals on Mars that on Earth are only known to be made at low temperature by living processes. So very exciting findings. But these findings also have implications for the possibility that life might be able to exist on Mars in the future, specifically Earth life. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about what do we know about what happens to us, to humans, when we leave Earth. So what happens to the human body in space? And so I want to take us back to the very first person that ever went to space. In 1961, the Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin. One of the things that's I think we sometimes forget is that at the time of Yuri Gagarin's flight, we had a lot of unanswered questions about what would actually happen to a person in space. There were people who were concerned that like your eyeballs would pop out of your head in space, or that you might not be able to swallow in lower gravity. And so one of the first things Yuri Gagarin did on this first space flight is he had a tube of food in like a toothpaste kind of tube, and he squirts it in his mouth, and he reports on his radio, swallowing is possible. So proving that was at least one less thing we had to worry about. At the time, the United States was engaged in a space race with the Soviet Union. And so the Soviets were the first to send people to space, but the United States soon after that would send Alan Shepard, who became the first American in space. And then the following year, John Glenn, who became the first American to orbit the Earth. So by then we were pretty sure that it was possible to at least survive being in space, but we still didn't know much about what being in space for a long time would do to a person. The real first major advances in this actually came after the moon landing. So in the moon landing, we actually didn't learn that much about what happens to the human body in that environment, because NASA actually made the decision not to collect much biomedical data on the Apollo astronauts. But the next mission that the US engaged in, Skylab, really did advance our understanding quite a bit. This was really the main focus of Skylab. And so during Skylab, there were 3 different missions, each longer than the one that preceded it. And we learned a lot about what being in space for a longer amount of time does to a person. For one thing, it became clear by then that most people that go to space get motion sick, at least initially. And they started to observe these fluid shifts. So in Earth's gravity, the fluid in our body is pushed down to our lower body by gravity. But in a zero gravity, in a weightless environment, those fluids are more evenly distributed in the body. And that feels like there's too much fluid in your head. So astronauts often report feeling like there's pressure in their face and in their head, almost like how it feels if you are sick, if you have a sinus infection or a cold. And so one of the things that does is it actually puts pressure on the eye. And we think that might explain another thing that I'll talk about, which is changes to vision. But one of the things that the body does to counteract having excess fluid in the upper body is to basically decrease the total amount of fluid in the body. And it does that by decreasing the blood volume. First, by reducing the amount of plasma. So basically, the astronauts are urinating out extra fluids. And then the body starts to even reduce the amount of red blood cells that are being produced. And so astronauts often come back to Earth anemic, so too few red blood cells. Being in space for a long amount of time, they noticed that when they came back to Earth, they were basically very out of shape, right? They had all these fitness declines. And so now astronauts do about 2 hours of exercise every single day to try to maintain their fitness as much as they can. There's an increase in height that happens in lower gravity, and that is because the spine starts to basically to straighten. So rather than having an S-shaped curve in the spine, it starts to straighten out. And then the soft tissues between the vertebrae expand, and that makes people gain a little bit of height. And so that's something that goes back to their previous height when they get back to Earth and gravity starts to push them down again. But the other things that happen are that basically the muscles aren't having to work as hard to counteract gravity, especially the muscles in the lower body, the legs and the back. And muscles are also linked to bone. So if your muscles aren't working as hard, your bones actually start to lose mineral density. So the bones will start to lose calcium and start to lose phosphorus. And so that leads to the bones being weaker, more brittle. So now, of course, we are able to do even more with the International Space Station. It's worth pointing out, I think, that the International Space Station has been continuously occupied since the year 2000. So sometimes when people talk about, a possible future of having humans in space, I think, well, wait a second, we're already there, right? We've actually had humans living in space continuously for all of the 21st century so far. And so I think it's just worth recognizing that in some ways that future has already arrived. On the International Space Station, we have continued to do a lot of biomedical and space medicine studies. One of the more famous ones was the NASA twin study, where Scott Kelly was going to spend a year in space. And because he has an identical twin brother, Mark Kelly, they were able to do quite detailed studies of what was happening to Scott Kelly's body while he was in space and compare it to what was happening to Mark Kelly while Mark was on Earth. Mark was also an astronaut. He's now a senator, but he was an astronaut, but he just wasn't in space at the same time. So this was like doing an experiment where you have a built-in control. You can compare Scott to Mark and sort of see what's different between them. And whatever's different, presumably, is due to the fact that Scott Kelly was in space for about a year. So what did they find? Well, this was the most detailed study yet of all of the things that happen to a person in space. Some of the things that they found were surprising. So the chromosomes, the ends of our chromosomes, have a structure called the telomere. And the telomere is thought to be linked to aging. So every time cells divide and they copy their DNA, they lose a little bit of the telomere. It gets shorter and shorter and shorter. And we think that this is linked to aging because once the telomeres get too short, you can have more damage to the chromosomes. And that seems to be associated with some of the deterioration that comes with aging. And so surprisingly, what happened to Scott Kelly when he was in space was that his telomeres got longer. But this was an example of something like many of the changes that happened in space, that when he went back to Earth, it basically went back to normal. So the telomeres got shorter again. One change that didn't go back to normal is changes to his DNA sequence. So he actually had mutations that happened to his DNA that did not, as far as we know, go back to normal after he came back to Earth. And that, I think, has important consequences or important implications for what will happen to people as we are spending more time in space or even living in space. There were also changes to the functioning of his immune system, and this has been seen by many astronauts, that the immune system starts to either become more sensitive or less sensitive. And then also there were changes to his microbiome. So the collection of bacteria and other microorganisms in and on his body, the community of microorganisms changed while he was in space. That is an example of something that more or less went back to normal, though, after he came back to Earth. Now, another thing that happened with Scott Kelly is he had experienced, even before his even before his year in space, in a previous mission to the International Space Station, he had had some vision deterioration. So his vision got worse while he was in space. And so they looked at this during his year in space. And what they found was that if you compare the structure of the choroid, that's this membrane that is behind the retina, basically this diagram is showing what the surface of his choroid looked like before flight, so pre-flight. And then this is what it looked like during flight day 270, so well into his year in space. And basically you can see that the structure here became more convoluted. There were these folds to the choroid. And that is thought to be the cause for why his vision was starting to deteriorate. And we think that this is actually due to there being excess fluid in the head caused by those fluid shifts from a lower gravity environment. And so having excess fluid seems to put pressure on the eye and cause the choroid to fold. So that, of course, also has important implications for people spending longer amounts of time in space. So today, NASA summarizes the various ways in which human spaceflight is hazardous in these 5 categories. So we've talked about a few of these already. So changes in gravity fields, changes in radiation are thought to be what causes the mutations that we saw in Scott Kelly's DNA. But then there's some other things too, like being in an isolated and confined environment. This is stressful, right? You're in a small space. You can't go out. You can't just leave and go for a walk if you need a break. Distance from Earth is likewise challenging because the farther you are from Earth, the harder it is to send new supplies or to get back to Earth if you need to. We just saw the very first medical evacuation from the International Space Station just a few weeks ago. The farther you are from Earth, the harder it is, or perhaps even becomes impossible to bring someone back if there's some kind of an emergency. And then there's psychological effects of knowing that you're far from home that are important. And speaking of psychological effects, being in a closed environment, being sealed up inside a relatively small space and being surrounded by a very hostile environment. This is stressful as well. And this has both psychological and physical effects on the body. So one of the things I got to do in researching this book was to go and visit some of the places where people are trying to study these psychological effects by creating simulated habitats like this one here. This is the Mars Desert Research Station in Utah, in the middle of the desert, in a place that kind of looks a lot like Mars, if you ignore the cactus. So I got to visit for a day during a simulation that they were doing. This is a facility that's owned by the Mars Society, which is a private organization. There's been other private efforts, like the maybe most famous one in some ways, or at least the largest, was this project in the early 1990s in Arizona called Biosphere 2, where they tried to create actually a hermetically sealed enclosure that includes replicas of different Earth ecosystems. So inside this large pyramid is a rainforest. There's also an ocean. There's a desert, and these cylindrical components here are actually where they were growing their food. So these were their agricultural units. And then 8 people stayed inside of this enclosed facility for 2 full years. Part of what they learned was that it's not just the challenges of growing your own food and getting the environmental components and atmospheric components right. They also had some real serious issues with the crew dynamics. So they've split into 2 different factions that basically couldn't talk to each other anymore after a while. And so I think, we have to understand how to avoid that kind of rift, because if that were to happen for settlers on Mars, it could be truly catastrophic. So these kinds of group dynamics, psychology of working together in this stressful environment, this is a very important part of space settlement. One of the other, I think, really important unknown questions is, if we are going to actually live beyond Earth, if we are not just going to go and visit, but if we actually want to build cities where people move there and live their entire lives, and this is meant to be something self-sustaining, right? That assumes that we're able to reproduce, that we can have children. And there's so many things that we don't know about that. We don't know whether whether pregnancy is affected by being in space. We don't know whether embryo development is affected by being in a lower gravity environment. We don't know what childbirth would look like, especially for a person whose muscles and bones have been weakened, perhaps by being in a lower gravity environment. And we don't know anything about child growth and development. Would a child born in Martian gravity, which is 1/3 the gravity of Earth, would they be able to build a skeletal structure? Would their bones be, strong enough to be able to grow and be healthy? Being strong enough to survive on Mars is also different from being strong enough to survive on Earth. So we don't know whether a child born on Mars would actually be able to come back to Earth, because we don't know whether their bones would be strong enough to support being 3 times heavier when they came to Earth. We also don't know whether a person born on Mars would develop an immune system or a heart that would be able to handle Earth, right? The heart has to pump blood against gravity. Again, being in a higher gravity environment might be too challenging. And from the immune system perspective, we don't know whether being raised in an environment where you're not exposed to most of the bacteria and viruses and other microorganisms that our immune systems basically learn to deal with without it being a problem, we don't know whether they would be able to come to Earth and be able to survive without getting sick just from breathing in the air and breathing in all of the microorganisms that are normally not dangerous for most of us. So I think those are important questions that we need to have answers to if we're going to be serious about actually, living on Mars. But this brings me to the question that started me on this quest in the first place, which is, let's assume that they're successful. Let's assume that we can go there and we can build a city and we can have children there. What happens next? So when I look at the planets in our solar system, it reminds me so much of islands. I'm an evolutionary biologist, as I said, and actually the place that I decided to become an evolutionary biologist was the Galapagos Islands. So this is me when I was a college student. I was invited by a professor at my university to go and be part of his field team, catching marine iguanas and performing a surgical procedure on them to retrieve a device that had been implanted in them. And for me, this was incredible. I had dreamed about doing some kind of expeditions for science like this as a kid. And here I was getting to actually do them. And so while I was there, I decided, this is what I want to do with my life. I want to be an evolutionary biologist and go to islands and study amazing creatures. And so, I look at the Galapagos Islands, which is, of course, known as being sort of the birthplace of the theory of evolution, right? Because it inspired Charles Darwin when he saw the finches and tortoises and other species on the Galapagos Islands. It inspired him to develop his theory of evolution by natural selection. And biologists still go back to the Galapagos and other islands to study evolution because islands are basically the ideal environment for evolutionary change. Anytime a species goes to a new place that is isolated and has a different environment from the place where they came from, it's going to lead to evolutionary change. And so when I look at the planets in our solar system, I see islands. And so, yes. Ah, okay. Yep. Let me pause for a moment. Yeah. Sure. Are you hearing me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So should I continue?
Okay. Thank you.
Sorry.
Okay, no problem. So I don't know at what point I cut out, but basically the point I was making is that to me, when I look at planets, they remind me of islands, right? Just on a much larger scale, clearly. So what lessons then from understanding evolution on islands might we be able to apply to our possible evolutionary future on other planets? Well, one pattern that we often see in species that are evolving on islands is that they change size. So we can think about lots of examples of species like the giant tortoises of the Galapagos Islands or the giant moa of New Zealand. Or another giant of New Zealand, which I got to see when I was there in December, is this amazing insect, the giant weta, which has the record for being the heaviest insect in the world. And so the idea is that species that are isolated on islands often evolve to be larger in size. Or in many cases, they do the opposite. They evolve to be much smaller. So many of the world's smallest species are actually island species, like this tiny little frog, cute little lizard, and there were actually many species of small elephants and small mammoths that were found on islands in the Mediterranean and in Asia. And so island dwarfism is another frequent pattern that we see. But you might ask, like, well, okay, so that is true for animals, but would that, also apply to humans? And actually, it seems like the answer may be yes, because we know of species of hominids, close relatives of Homo sapiens in the same genus Homo, that actually seem to follow this island rule. The island rule is what we call it when species change size on islands. So Homo floresiensis was discovered in 2003 on the island of Flores in Indonesia, and it stood only a little more than a meter tall. And so this appears to be an example of island dwarfism, where its ancestors were a much taller species of hominid, we believe, and this island was never connected to mainland Asia by any sort of land bridge. So somehow its ancestors crossed open water to get there, and then presumably were stranded on this island and appeared to have evolved to be smaller. One of the reasons we think that's what happened is that there's a second example of this now. More recently, a species of also short hominids were found on an island in the Philippines, on the island of Luzon. So this is Homo luzonensis, which also is an island that was never connected to the mainland by any sort of land bridge. So it does appear that hominids are also subject to these changes in body sizes on islands. So perhaps one of the changes we might expect for future generations of Martians would be to change body size, perhaps to become smaller. So what would Martians look like? There's lots of depictions from science fiction, right? I don't know about any of these being too likely. I don't think that one. But what kinds of predictions could we make? Well, I actually think that most of the changes that we might expect to happen to people living on Mars over evolutionary time would be changes that would be more subtle. They wouldn't be very obvious physical changes. Despite what you read in some of the newspapers or some of the tabloids, like this one, which basically this is the image that they came up with, and it says that that I'm claiming that this is the consequences of what Elon Musk is trying to do. It's not exactly quite what I've said, but it's kind of fun to play with. But actually, like I said, I think the changes would be much more subtle. Most of the changes would be biochemical or cellular, things like the ability to tolerate, radiation and be able to, survive higher levels of radiation is a possibility. One way that we might do that is through changes in skin pigmentation. We know that melanin provides natural protection against ultraviolet radiation. And so perhaps having more melanin in the skin could be helpful, or new types of pigments, which we know in some species on Earth are helpful for radiation protection. So pigments like carotenoids. Maybe we would have more orange-colored skin if those types of changes took place in future generations. But basically, my argument is that if we are successful in creating settlements beyond Earth and having children there, and we're living there for many generations, we might not be able to predict the exact evolutionary changes that will happen, but we should expect evolutionary change. That should be our default assumption, because we know that is what happens to species when they go to another place that is isolated and has a different environment. It's what's happened to every species on islands here on Earth. But at the same time, natural selection and other mechanisms of evolution, these are harsh realities. This is not a necessarily pleasant way to get better at living in a new environment. Natural selection involves a lot of death and suffering. This is not the future that we would hope for our children. So even though eventually, if we do nothing, we might see a new species of human evolving on Mars or any other planet that we go to, I think that another possibility is that we might take matters into our own hands and try to help people to tolerate these conditions, to try to improve their lives by using technology like genetic engineering to enable or enhance the bodies of people living in these environments. So one example of ways that we might do that would be to look at examples of organisms on Earth that are able to survive in extreme conditions. Species like tardigrades that are able to not only survive extreme conditions on Earth, but have been taken into space and have actually been able to, in some cases, survive being exposed to the vacuum of space and the harshness of space radiation. So we know of other organisms like some microbes, Deinococcus radiodurans being one that is able to survive in nuclear waste, very high levels of radiation. Others like this one that are able to survive levels of radiation that far exceed actually any kind of radiation exposures that we would likely experience on Mars or elsewhere. So how can we use that information? Well, one idea proposed by biologists like Christopher Mason, who's at Weill Cornell College in Weill Cornell Medicine, in New York City. His lab has taken some of the genes from tardigrades and put them into human cells in culture in the lab, and basically shown that they can express the proteins that are associated with tardigrades' ability to tolerate high radiation exposures. So that seems to suggest that human cells could make those same proteins and perhaps would be able to endure higher levels of radiation. And in fact, the cells that have been given that kind of genetic change have shown more radiation tolerance than cells that have not. So, so the idea is, at least, seems to be something that's possible. The other possibility is, aside from genetic engineering, would be to basically equip our bodies with machinery or devices of some sort that improve our ability to tolerate the conditions of space. So the idea of a cyborg, part human, part machine, that term, which we often think of as being something from science fiction, it actually came from this paper published in 1960 that was suggesting this idea for enabling humans for deep space exploration. And so this idea, isn't just something from science fiction. It is actually an idea that comes from space medicine, or at least the idea of enhancing the human body for space. And so you can imagine something like, for example, having a brain-computer interface, which is a technology that already exists and is being improved on now, in which you can have a chip implanted in your brain that allows you to control a computer with your mind. So if you take that idea and then imagine that you're able to, say, control a rover with your mind, or maybe an exoskeleton that helps you to support your body in a lower gravity or a higher gravity environment, and you're able to control that exoskeleton with your mind, the same way, really, that we control our muscles. So in this sense, you can imagine sort of like this merging of human and machine being kind of the way that we adapt to living in space. It's not adaptation in the sense that I think of it as a biologist, although perhaps I need to expand my view of what I think adaptation is. And I wrestle with that in the book. I write about how, I had one idea about what adaptation meant going into researching this topic, and I came away actually with a much broader view of what we might be able to do. So perhaps in the future, our descendants living on Mars or elsewhere in space might be something that looks more like this, more like part human, part machine, part robot, part genetically engineered organism. The question then, I think, is that what we want? Is that a future that we think is a positive future, a desirable future? Is that the future that we want to head towards? And that's the kind of the dialogue that I'm trying to have with people now. And I'd be interested in all of your thoughts about this as well. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your time. I hope I've come through clearly, and I really look forward to hearing your questions and thoughts. Thanks so much. Oh, I'm not able to hear you.
Okay, now?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Now we can do the question if there are.
Questions?
Any question?
Produco io.
Chiedi al professore, intanto congratulazioni per l'intervento. Se è possibile un adattamento o ancora di più una speciazione dell'uomo sapiens a qualcosa di diverso, quante generazioni ci vorranno?
Okay, for an adaptation of the human being on Mars, how many generations do you think it would take the process?
To change the species.
Change the species, of course.
From sapiens to
Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. So I will say that it depends on a few things, and these are things that that we could think about. So basically, it depends first of all on how many people we send initially. So the size of a founding population and the composition of the founding population is known to be a major factor in the future evolution of island species, or really of any species. So we have this this idea in evolutionary biology of the founder effect. Basically, the founder effect is when anytime some individuals found or establish a new population, the genetic composition of that founding population has a big influence on the possible evolutionary future. And what usually happens, it's a small number of individuals, and they're usually not representative of the larger population that they come from. So usually what happens is you end up getting a drastic reduction in genetic diversity in the initial starting population. And that restricts the amount of possible adaptation that the population can have in the future. So that's something that we could control in theory. We could decide to send either a larger founding population or a very genetically diverse founding population. And either or both of those things would improve or enhance the ability to adapt in the future. And it would also speed up the amount of evolutionary change that would happen. But the other factor is, how often are there people traveling between Earth and Mars? And importantly, how often are they exchanging genes, right? How often are they interbreeding? Because the other thing that we know from evolutionary biology is that if you have two populations that are very isolated from each other, meaning that they're not interacting and exchanging genes, they will rapidly separate or diverge and become more different. But if they're exchanging genes, if individuals are moving back and forth and mating, then that can slow down the ability of those populations to become different from one another. So if we go to Mars and we keep sending people to Mars, and if people from Mars keep coming back to Earth, right, then that will slow down how quickly people on Mars become different. But if we don't, for example, if, as I was saying, it might be difficult or dangerous for people born on Mars to come back to Earth, or if new diseases emerge on Mars, as I think could happen, that might get difficult for people from Earth to go to Mars, or if they go, they would be it would be dangerous for them to interact with the people from Mars. That could rapidly accelerate the separation and the adaptation for people on Mars to become different. So I've estimated that, with all of that in consideration, it could be as quickly as 10 generations that you could actually start to get noticeable evolutionary changes with people on Mars, especially if there's not a lot of movement back and forth, which I think will be more difficult than people have anticipated. Does that answer the question?
Yes.
Okay. I will do one. Linked to this, Did you see the show The Expanse?
Yes. Yes, I like that.
How plausible is that? Because
Yeah.
I think
Well, I think they get some things. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, sorry. For what I saw, I think it's well done, but the population on Mars there has a low bone density, has muscular problems, and also for that issues. And coming back to Earth, they almost cannot stand. And for that, for the muscular part, do you think maybe weighting or clothes there to actually make more weight on the body could counteract that or something like this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I really like the Expanse. I thought it is very well done, and they did think through a lot of the possible evolutionary scenarios. I think that the idea of like gravity torture that they include in the Expanse is very on point, because I think if you were born and raised in a much lower gravity environment, imagine coming to a place where you weigh 3 times the amount that you weighed on your planet. It's one thing for an individual person, like an adult, to go and experience that. But if you were born and raised in that environment, right, and your body never really forms a stronger skeleton, I think it would be difficult for you to tolerate that. So I think they did. I think they thought through a lot of those scenarios very, very effectively in that series. Yeah, I'm a big fan.
Okay, thanks. Other questions?
It's coming.
Good evening, and thank you, Professor. So my question is about the 5 hazards that we can encounter when we will go on Mars. How much a good training could mitigate these 5 hazards?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think training can help with some of those things quite a bit, and we see with with astronauts who go to the International Space Station, for example, they're able to do quite well with their training, being in an isolated, confined environment, surrounded by a hostile environment, being in a much lower gravity field, being in a somewhat higher radiation environment, being relatively far from Earth. Training does help them quite a bit, and so I think it could help as well. But there's things that we don't know, right? So, for example, as I was mentioning before, being unable to return to Earth if you have some kind of an emergency. I don't know how much training is going to be able to prepare you for that reality. Looking up in the night sky and seeing a tiny little dot, and that's Earth, right? How does that affect you psychologically? I think we're kind of going back to the early days, like, before the first humans went to space, when we had basic questions of, not just would your eyes pop out of your head, but like people wondered, would you lose your mind? Would you go crazy by looking out at Earth from above? People didn't know, and I think, in some ways we have answers, and in other ways we still don't, because we don't know what it would be like to be quite that far from home. But yeah, I think training will probably do a lot for people. But then again, we're talking about mostly the first people to go. What do you do for the people who are born there? And it brings up ethical considerations. There's a lot of ethical concerns in all of this, right? A child who's born in that environment, they haven't consented to being in this situation. And so, you're putting them in a dangerous situation where, again, they might not be able to come back to Earth, or if they do, it might be very, very hard on them. So, how much can you train them? How much can you prepare them? Would their education be sufficient to kind of allow them to be able to be okay with that, not just physically, but psychologically as well? I think we don't know.
sharing information about this. I think it's, sorry, I can't hear. Okay, hi. Thank you for your presentation, first of all. Then one thing that it's really interesting about this last sentence you said, that they didn't choose, but it's difficult to also teach them how it's the way and how to prepare them in that way. Maybe it's also they want to come back to Earth. They never been to Earth. How it's I have a similarities maybe with those people that always lived in a dangerous environment, let's say on a tiny little city in the mountains, and that city is near and the mountain has to come down, and they don't want to live because it's their lives. And maybe this is something that can be studied in the same way, because they always stayed in a place that it's their home, even if it's dangerous.
Yeah. I think that's a good point. So I think we can learn a lot from, you know, examples of similar things on Earth, right? And so, yeah, you know, you're right that children are born into all sorts of dangerous situations on Earth, or in, you know, situations that they didn't choose. I guess every child was born into a situation that they didn't choose, but, you know, so what can we learn from that? Well, one thing I'll point out, as others have pointed out before, is, you know, we have come to inhabit nearly every part of Earth, right? People live nearly everywhere on Earth, but there are a few places that we don't live, right? So Antarctica is an interesting comparison, because, yeah, we go and visit Antarctica, or people go and do research in Antarctica, even spend, you know, a whole year at a research base in Antarctica. But so far, nobody has tried raising their family there. You know, I don't think too many people are eager to go and raise children in Antarctica. And Antarctica is nowhere near as extreme as Mars is in many ways. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a very harsh place, but you can step outside and you can still breathe the oxygen, and your body fluids don't boil off from the low pressure if you know, forgot your spacesuit. So, you know, I guess that's the kind of thing that makes me think that we're probably not ready yet for raising children on Mars, if we're not even comfortable with raising children in Antarctica. And I'm not suggesting we should be raising children in Antarctica, but it's a lot easier to get back from Antarctica than it is to get back from Mars. So, but no, I think it's a good point that we can learn a lot from looking at examples on Earth. And one of the things I describe in the book is that if you think about, you know, immigrants to other countries, right? The first generation of immigrants, they often still feel a close connection with the country that they came from, and the culture. But then with each generation, there's just a little bit less of that, right? And, you know, my grandparents were the first generation that came to the United States. And so I'm a, you know, third generation American on my father's side. And, you know, we feel only kind of a very loose connection back to the countries that they came from. And I don't think my children feel much of any connection to it. So I think the same will be true of people on Mars. You know, I mean, how long will they feel a connection to Earth? How long will they feel like they are from Earth? Eventually, I think they will see themselves as being Martian. And that has all sorts of important implications, not just biological, but psychological, cultural, political, all sorts of interesting things.
Okay. Luca. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much again for the presentation. I would actually have 3 questions probably, but I will try. I will do the first 2 that are kind of intertwined. So, if I understood correctly, you mentioned that we already saw that, for example, for astronauts or people living in the ISS, we are seeing like the immune system getting more or less sensitive. Do we know why is that? I mean, why sometimes more, why sometimes less? Are there any criteria behind that? Do they find any, you know, connections? Why it's one of the 2 ways, let's say, connected to immune system and stuff. So as you also mentioned, like for kids growing on Mars, they cannot go to Earth mostly because if they can get even the most common flu, they will probably die from that. But the same thing will go like on the other way. As you said, if we develop, humanity develop new diseases, not develop, but new diseases are born on Mars, people from Earth cannot go there. What can be a possible solution for that? Like vaccinations or something? Would it be a possible way? Or yeah, which are the possible ways? Then yeah, I would have maybe a third quick question, but I will ask after this one.
Okay.
Thank you.
So yeah, great question. So first of all, with what do we know about how the immune system is affected by being in space? There's there's some indications, for example, in the twin study, that one of the first things that happens, or like early on in adjusting to space, is that the immune system kind of tends to go to be hyper activated, like you get extra sensitivity, but that seems to sort of decrease with time. And then one of the longer effects is kind of a decrease in the function of the immune system, an immune suppression. And one of the ways that that is manifested is in having viruses, latent viruses that are your body has been exposed to this virus, but it's in your body, but it's not actually affecting you, right? This happens with a lot of viruses that we're exposed to as a child. You recover, and the virus is still in your body, but it's a latent virus. It's not actually making you sick. But in some cases, it can be reactivated. So this is like the virus that causes chickenpox. I don't know if it's called the same thing in Italy, but chickenpox is one that you can then have reactivated as an older adult and develop shingles. So that same thing has happened to a number of astronauts in space, is that there's this reactivation of latent viruses. And that is known to be something that happens basically when the immune system is suppressed. Why is the immune system being suppressed in space? We don't actually know. It's hard for us to know whether it is something specific to the space environment, lower gravity, higher radiation, it could be, or it could just be a general stress response, right? Again, being in an isolated, confined environment. Astronauts are often, not getting quite enough sleep, right? It's harder to sleep in space. They're busy. They're on this tightly regimented schedule. Is it just that they're not getting enough sleep? Their circadian rhythms are often really thrown off because you don't have the normal daylight cues of the sun rising and setting. Well, the sun rises and sets, but every few minutes or whatever. I forgot the exact timing, but you're orbiting the Earth, so you have many sunrises and many sunsets per day. So your body is thrown off of its natural rhythms, and that may be part of what's causing the immune system to be suppressed. So that's something that we know happens in space, but again, we don't necessarily understand why. Is it the conditions of space, or is it just a general stress response? But to go to the question about what happens to the microorganisms there, and how can we mitigate that? So there have been a lot of studies now of how microorganisms change in space. So one of the things I got to do was visit the NASA microbiology lab at Johnson Space Center here in Houston, where they are monitoring microbial growth on the ISS. So they are taking swabs of the surfaces and letting the bacteria grow, and then sequencing their DNA and studying, what are these bacteria, what are these microorganisms. And so they've been able to show that, maybe this isn't surprising, but they evolve, they have changed. Bacteria are being affected by being in space. One of the changes that has been documented is increased virulence. In other words, increased ability of a microorganism to cause disease in humans. So that is kind of concerning, right? You've got lower immune response, and the microbes are becoming more dangerous by being in space. There's also been evolution of antibiotic resistance among bacteria growing on the International Space Station. So, we know these microbes go with us when we go to space. We know that they are evolving, and we know that our immune systems are changing, even if we don't understand why. So all of that combined is part of what really makes me concerned about the role of infectious disease in space settlement and the ability to move between planets. So if you think through the scenario, like, okay, we go to Mars, we bring microbes with us, those microbes are evolving. You could imagine new types of infectious diseases emerging on Mars that if you go there from Earth, you know, you might get sick. But of course, we're used to having to, get a vaccine before we travel someplace on Earth that has infectious diseases that aren't found where we're from. So maybe we just get a vaccine to protect us against the Martian diseases. And that's possible. But I think the reverse is more serious. The people born on Mars coming to Earth, I think it would be much harder to mitigate that because it's not just 1 or 2 or even 10 microorganisms that you need to include in your Earth vaccine. It could be like all Earth microbes or a large number of Earth microbes. And we don't even know what those microbes are. We're still in the process of trying to document and describe the microbial diversity on our planet. So we wouldn't even know what to put in the vaccine, right? So, so I think it's not impossible that we could do that, but we're nowhere near being able to even know, what to do.
Thank you. Can I would just, okay, this is maybe a very naive question, but so it happened to me to read some articles about the fact that our body reacts to nature. Like, for example, I read an article, tell me actually if it was wrong or it made sense, that when, for example, we are stressed, we can take a walk into nature, and just by looking at trees and stuff, the level of cortisol, is correct term, goes down and stuff like that. Okay, thank you. So this happens to us because, okay, we grew up on Earth, we experience nature and stuff like that. For kids growing up on Mars, will this still be true? I mean, is it somewhat connected to, ancestors or like their experience as a child? I mean, how would this happen, like to say, in a child born in Mars?
I think this is a really good point. Like, I think this is actually a serious issue because, there's a lot of studies that show that we have this just inherent connection with nature. It's been called biophilia, right? We just have this like built-in innate love of nature, and we feel better when we're around nature, and we feel worse when we're disconnected from it. And of course, we don't know because nobody has ever been born and raised in an environment that's completely devoid of nature. But in situations where people have been, institutionalized or in some other way, like raised really in a situation where they're not exposed to much of the natural world, it has profound psychological consequences. So some people have imagined like, well, we'll just use virtual reality and we'll simulate what it's like to walk in a forest or be in the mountains or something like that. Does that work? I don't know. I'm kind of skeptical as a biologist. To me, this is very important and very near and dear to my heart, the idea that, connections with nature are important. And I'll just add that, you can also think about like why we have pets. Why do we have, dogs or cats or other animals as companions? And, for most of us, it's like it's an important part of our lives that make us feel good. There's a lot of studies that show that, petting a dog or a cat lowers our blood pressure and makes us calmer. And my wife, who works as a nurse, they often have, she works with children, and they have dogs that they will bring in, therapy dogs that help children that are coping with, severe medical situations, and it really does help them to feel a little bit better. I have argued that we probably won't be bringing animals with us to Mars for a number of reasons. I could be wrong, but I think there's good reasons not to bring dogs or cats or livestock, in part because we'd be competing with them for resources that are likely to be in short supply, but also because it helps us to avoid the risk of any future infectious diseases. So many of our infectious diseases are diseases that we acquire from animals. And so this is an opportunity to really reduce the number of infectious diseases that at least the ones that we bring with us from Earth. So what would it mean to not be able to have pets with us on Mars? I think there could be big psychological consequences.
Thank you. Other questions? Okay.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for the presentation, first of all. We know that specific developed drugs are used in space missions. And do you know if there are studies about, new studies about development of specific drugs to overcome or to mitigate harsh Mars environment? And what's your opinion about the use of drugs for this mission, also from an ethical point of view? Thank you.
Yeah. It's a very interesting question. Yeah, I know, for the most part, my understanding is that most of the medications that are used in space are the same as or very similar to the medications that are used in Earth. I know on Earth, I know that in the field of space medicine, there's research looking at whether there could be different pharmacological effects of certain medications in in the environment of space, in a lower gravity environment, for example. It's not something that I know that much about, though, if I'm being honest. So my understanding is, for the most part, most medications work in a similar way in the environments of space as they work here. But in the long-term situations that we're talking about, especially children, I keep coming back to that because I think it's such a big unknown. Would we be needing to give, for example, human growth hormones to children to help them to, increase their development if they're having to grow in a lower gravity environment? There have been no studies on this that I'm aware of. So, I think that using drugs might be, again, necessary. I think the ethical thing you brought up, it's such an interesting and important point. And in some ways, the ethics get more complicated, or they're almost backwards in some situations, because in a situation where you might consider it unethical to use a certain medication or do a certain treatment on Earth, if you're in an environment that is so hazardous and so dangerous, there can be situations where not doing that is actually unethical. If you had the ability to, for example, use gene editing techniques to change a person's DNA, and this is something that we have questions about the ethical basis for it right now on Earth. But if you're not doing that, are you causing more pain and suffering by not doing that? I think these are really important things, and to me, this is like we need to be thinking through this before it makes sense to start having children in those environments.
Okay, thank you. Giorgio?
Say a couple of things later at the end. First,
Okay.
other questions.
Other questions? Yeah.
Mi collego
Italiano. Ok.
Mi collego alla domanda precedente, cioè, dato che anche gli esseri umani sulla Terra, no? Cioè, usano le droghe per adattarsi meglio all'ambiente. Dato che anche sulla Terra è sempre più difficile, diciamo, in modo invece che sapere se per il professore è così scontato, diciamo, che in futuro sia più difficile vivere su Marte che non sulla Terra.
Okay. I'll try to translate this. We on Earth we are using drugs for substances, not drugs. Substances for living on the planet, make life easier. Just a second.
In sostanza se l'evoluzione della Terra, per come sta avvenendo, il cambiamento del clima,
Dici se
porta l'uomo, diciamo,
che sarà più difficile vivere sulla Terra.
dovresti adattare anche a vivere sulla Terra.
Ah, okay. Do you think there will be a need for the humans to adapt even to live on Earth in the future, and of course on Mars. So if okay, on Mars it's difficult, but going this way on Earth it would be difficult as well. Do you think what's the most difficult about it? Do you think it's in 100 years, 200 years, would be more difficult to live on Earth or on Mars? That's the question.
Oh, okay. So the question is, in 100 years, do I think it'll be more difficult to live on Earth or on Mars? Like with the idea that Earth is changing as well? Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. I think no matter how bad Earth gets, it will always be a much better place to live than Mars. I think that I have very serious concerns about the changes to our planet that we are causing, and I worry about that a lot. But I think there's almost nothing that we could do to our planet that would make it a worse place to live than Mars. I think the reality, part of what I try to show in my book is what the reality of living on Mars really is. That it's not maybe impossible for us to live there, but we evolved to be creatures of this planet, and even if you change the atmosphere on Mars, even if you change the pressure, even if you control the amount of radiation exposure, it's hard to change the gravitational field. And just the fact that our bodies are so well adapted to Earth's gravity means that being in a lower gravity environment is always likely to be a harsher place than being on Earth. So yeah, I worry about our changing planet, but I think Mars is just such a challenging place to live that it'll always be worse.
Yeah. As I said before, at least we can breathe here. So
yeah, for now.
For now. Okay. Altre domande? Other questions?
One other question.
So you tell that living Mars is challenging. Given by the sci-fi, I remember that there is an idea about the terraforming Mars. What about it?
Yeah. So that's a good follow up from the last question, because I was saying, like, even if we were able to modify Mars's environment, right, I still think it would be hard. So yeah, I considered this, and I talked to people who have given this serious consideration and studied it, and I mean there are some ways in which we might be able to make Mars more Earth-like, right? We could perhaps increase the atmospheric density. We know that in the past it did have a denser atmosphere. We know that it had a milder climate because we know that water was running across the surface. We can see evidence of erosion in canyons, and so we know that it must have supported liquid water on the surface, which meant it was milder, and it must have had a more of an atmospheric density then. So maybe it could have that again. But the thing is that many of the proposals for how you would do that involve things like detonating nuclear weapons on the poles to, cause, water vapor and carbon dioxide that's frozen at the poles to become a gas and to add to the atmospheric density. So you could maybe do that. Let's imagine that. Or you could take asteroids from the asteroid belt that have nitrogen or carbon dioxide or oxygen and slam them into Mars and increase its atmospheric density that way. But the problem is that because Mars is small compared to Earth, its gravitational field is smaller, right? And it doesn't have a magnetosphere. There's no magnetic field surrounding the planet. And so the solar wind is constantly stripping away its atmosphere. It just can't hold on to its atmosphere. And so we think this is, part of what happened to its atmosphere in the past. And it's likely to always be an issue that anything you put in the atmosphere is going to get stripped away by the solar wind. So basically, any of those things that you could do, those are temporary solutions. And once you have people living there, then you definitely don't want to be detonating nuclear weapons at large scale or slamming asteroids into the planet. So I think that's the issue, is that even if you could build an atmosphere and make the planet more mild in its climate, those would only be temporary solutions. And then once there's people there, it's really hard to continue to keep it up.
Thank you. Other questions? Okay. Okay, Giorgio.
I just wanted to ask a question. You you asked earlier about schiaparelli canals. That
Yes.
in Italian, canals, it can be used both for artificial and natural, like in little rivers, mountain rivers, something like that. It's used a lot for artificial rivers, but it can be used also for natural rivers. So sure, it should have been something that it's said by Schiaparelli, and someone heard it and misheard it and translated in the wrong way. Sure. So I want just to answer you this curiosity. And the other thing is that maybe, I don't know if you know, but we are located, as I said earlier, in Turin, that is in the northwest of Italy, and it's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, pole of space activities for Italy. And we have a lot of companies, space companies located here. And for example, we have the company where part of the ESS were built, if I remember well. And also should have been, I don't know if it's still the base of ExoMars, should be launched in the next years. But yes, should have been the base, and maybe it will be the base of that space. So I just wanted to say that here in Turin we are a lot of lovers of space and space companies. I want just to give you this hint.
That's very cool. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and it's wonderful to get to talk with you all and hear your questions and thoughts and ideas. And please feel free to reach out if any of you have other questions or thoughts or want to keep in touch.
Okay. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
We too. If you want to say hi and say bye.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Thank you all. Appreciate it. Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.